Hello there. You're listening to Manufacturing Tomorrow, brought to you by the Ohio Manufacturing Institute at The Ohio State University, where we discuss the latest innovations, challenges, and advancements shaping the world of manufacturing. I'm your host, Katherine Kelly. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Richard Barnett, Chief Marketing Officer at Fusion Risk Management, a leading provider of operational resilience software and services. Richard has spent more than a decade working directly with manufacturers and supply chain organizations, helping them understand how their risk exposure is shifting as operations become more automated and interconnected. Fusion's latest Enterprise Resilience Report offers a striking finding. Manufacturers report feeling more prepared for disruption than they did in 2021, and that confidence may itself be a vulnerability. Today's conversation is about a risk that manufacturers may not see coming, not the disruptions that keep plant managers up at night from a decade ago, but a new generation of operational threats driven by AI, interconnected systems, and the growing convergence of information technology and operations technology on the factory floor. Richard, welcome to Manufacturing Tomorrow.
Thank you. Great to be with you, Catherine.
Let's set the stage. Fusion's Enterprise Resilience Report found that manufacturer confidence in their resilience capabilities has actually increased since 2021 during the COVID pandemic. Fewer concerns about incidents response and reporting were outlined. Why
hmm
isn't that necessarily good news?
Well, I think manufacturers collectively, even globally, should feel proud and confident than more than they did 5 years ago because they've actually invested heavily in resilience in many ways. They've improved response to disruptions experienced during COVID, which were complex and interconnected supplier shortages, severe weather, logistics disruptions, even tariffs following later, and the scenario planning for cost, related to different emerging, changing tariff regimes. All those are important investments. The challenge is that today's risk landscape is different. Manufacturers are now more dependent on AI, cloud platforms, more connected operational technology, and increasingly complex supplier ecosystems. Those were the disruptions where most resilience programs were not built around. So we have this shifting landscape of new vulnerabilities that's emerging and accelerating. So one thing we've seen consistently when we do an assessment with a manufacturer, and we have an enterprise resilience index that provides a very comprehensive way of assessing objectively where readiness and maturity is around resilience. And one of the things that's really interesting is that the initial rating is typically one level, full maturity level higher in their confidence that they perceive that they're at than actually when we do an objective assessment. And that's because it's not because they're doing a poor job. It simply reflects that many programs haven't been tested against today's risks. Confidence is valuable, but only when it's tested against today's risks, not yesterday's. And that's an easy bias to have. Look how well we did. We're good. And no, we got to keep evolving and keep understanding the emerging threat landscape.
Let's take AI, for example. AI is showing up in manufacturing operations faster than most resilience frameworks have been updated to address it. You alluded to that. So what
Yeah.
kinds of AI-related incidents are you seeing or anticipating that manufacturers aren't prepared for?
Well, I think it's subtle. I mean, when you look at AI systems and their adoption, it is often embedded or supporting existing like planning systems for, if you think about quality management, quality control, predictive maintenance. When they're enhanced with AI models, the challenge is that AI systems often don't fail; they degrade gradually. So what happens is you can have embedded algorithms or the data services that it's like looking at in terms of building a recursive model that's optimizing slowly becomes less accurate or biased in one direction or the other. You don't see the impact until you see increasing, say, warranty claims or quality defects can begin reported weeks or months later. And so AI can also unintentionally cause concentration risk. So if you think about procurement optimization for a source of supply to cost, those consistently will favor the same suppliers or even the same region of supply. And so organizations gradually become more exposed without anyone explicitly deciding to create that concentration because it's automated and it's optimizing to its objective goals or functions that it's trying to solve for. So it's doing its job, but introducing concentration risk. And the third is that AI is increasingly becoming integrated into production planning operational systems. It's kind of woven now into from supply chain planning and scenario planning now into the manufacturing scheduling, and operational systems at the factory or the plant level. And in those environments, manufacturers need stronger governance over how those recommendations for automated production scheduling and rollover, et cetera, how they're approved and how they're connected to the operational technology systems that are there. The challenge really isn't AI itself, it's understanding and managing the new dependencies that AI creates, and some of them are subtle and not obvious.
Connecting plant floor systems to enterprise networks and the internet creates real operational value and real exposure. For a
Yeah.
manufacturer who's been running legacy OT systems for decades, what are the most dangerous assumptions they might be making right now?
Well, I think there's one assumption that operational technology is still isolated, because that's generally how it was for years. You'd have SCADA systems, you'd have stuff that was just, on the plant, on the floor, locally managed hardware, et cetera. Today, though, the reality is that predictive maintenance, cloud analytics, remote monitoring, new MES integration, is all connecting OT to the rest of the enterprise much more than organizations may fully realize, particularly because it's maybe happened over time. Um, and the other misconception is that these legacy environments, which they're often, running and in place for years, are not attractive targets. And unfortunately, the opposite is true because they're difficult to patch. They remain in service for years. The update cycle is typically maybe annually in some cases. And therefore, they're actually more exposed. But I think the third but most important misconception is that IT recovery equals business recovery. So if you kind of think about recovering service is important, recovering production is actually what matters. So, depending on the industry, we know these statistics. 1 hour of production downtime on a line can cost tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. So customers don't care about how quickly IT systems recover. They care about whether their deliveries are delivered on time. And that becomes really important because we start thinking about where these emerging vulnerabilities are and exposures to OT. We really need to have an integrated view of not just an isolated, siloed view of IT recovery and OT system recovery. We need to understand the full dependencies beforehand because business recovery is actually what we want to measure and what customers actually care about.
Yes, and as you know, the timelines and the priorities of IT versus OT can be completely different.
Yeah.
Um, so when we're and then modern manufacturers are deeply dependent on third-party platforms and the supply chain partners they can't control. So how do you think about resilience when the failure point isn't inside your plant walls?
Well, I think we've been operating anyone kind of in modern manufacturing that's, somewhat, globalized in terms of their sources of supply or even where their manufacturing locations are to, address even a domestic market. Everything is really interconnected, interdependent. I think we've understood that for a long time. COVID obviously was a massive stress test to those supply chain dependencies. But now we have to layer on the SaaS systems that oftentimes now are embedded increasingly critical for those key business services, whether it's the inbound supply chain or it's what's happening through the manufacturing process or outbound fulfillment to customers. So we've got cloud ERP, we've got transportation, logistics visibility platforms, supplier portals, quality systems, et cetera. They're all essential parts now of manufacturing operations. There's no dividing line that says this is only what's in the plant and this is outside the plant, and those are separate dependencies. The CrowdStrike, outage, if you go back to 2024, is probably the most visible example of this concentration risk because many organizations had very resilient operations, but they were simultaneously dependent on the same technology provider, outside their four walls. And that single software issue disrupted across industries, disrupted airlines, logistics providers, manufacturers, healthcare organizations, and financial institutions all at the same time. And that's the new concentration risk. So the strongest organizations, don't basically hope that the providers never fail. They model those scenarios in advance. They understand this is really important, which in context to their business, what products, what customers would be affected, and then they identify alternatives before an event occurs. So resilience really in this environment starts well before the disruption. It starts about understanding those dependencies and then thinking very carefully about the new dependencies that might be emerging from an IT systems landscape, SaaS systems, et cetera, not the traditional single source of supplier or my material flows that are coming in, which we've optimized for, and we've tried to do what we can maybe to diversify, lanes and supplier sources, for example. Now we've got to extend that same thinking into the broader full dependency landscape for that manufacturing line and the context of that in the business.
You've stated operational resilience evolves from a compliance-driven exercise to a strategic business capability. What does that shift actually look like for a small to mid-sized manufacturer, in terms of the leadership attention,
Yeah.
budget, and then the organizational structure?
Well, I think you're poking at something that is to me, having spent a lot of time in supply chain over years and thinking about procurement risk and supply chain risk, and how do we get better at planning and scenario planning and flexible manufacturing lines, et cetera. So much work has been done in this area, but the problem is the lens of compliance is really narrow. So organizations that sort of have their business continuity planning owned by a compliance team, the key question is, do we have a plan? The organizations that are more mature in this resilience journey that we measure, there's an unlock where the executive leadership is focused on answering the question, can we make good decisions during a disruption? And that's a very different set of questions. The work, the dependency mapping, the business impact assessments, et cetera, that work is great. That data modeling and remapping of scenarios is a great starting point, but it needs to continue to extend, and needs to be owned basically by operations, finance, procurement, technology teams all coming together. They need to be involved because those investments in resilience is what impacts revenue, customer commitments, and financial performance. And I've seen organizations spend 24 to 72 hours simply determining what was impacted by a disruption. So during that time, executives can make priority decisions around, estimate financial exposure, prioritize which customer segments maybe needs to be, prioritized but shorted, based on, delivery, lead time, and capability. And operations can prioritize recovery. The key insight is that reducing decision time often creates more value than reducing recovery time. So the real advantage isn't having more plans, like from a compliance perspective, it's making better decisions faster. And that's a change in mindsets, organizational design. It's getting more folks involved in understanding the dependencies and how to make decisions collectively based upon their different lines of perspective and control that come up during a disruption.
If a plant manager or a VP of operations is listening right now and thinking, we've got gaps, where do you tell them to start? What is the first move that actually matters?
This is interesting because you can get sometimes lost in the scope and complexity of this work. And so what we often will do, which is really high impact, is work with a manufacturer in a very targeted way with like a small workshop, small cross-functional team. And that's what I would recommend for manufacturing leaders that are listening. So don't start with software. Just start by focusing on, take your highest revenue product line and ask a simple question: what has to work for this product to ship? So map the suppliers, but also map the production systems, facilities, logistics providers, the people, and the technology that supports that end-to-end flow view. And I mean, think about it as a bill of material, right? I mean, we've done a really good job of classically understanding material dependencies. Say if I'm doing discrete manufacturing and understand all my parts and components and maybe my alternates, right? Same concept, but now extended to the landscape of dependencies more broadly, not just the material flow. That is a really interesting lens, and what we found is that we've brought in teams, and it's interesting we have a cross-functional team answering this question because if you bring operations, procurement, and IT, you'll understand and uncover critical dependencies or single points of failures that were unknown in the first 30 minutes, and that's really exciting. So that's the starting process, and it starts with doing the dependency mapping, but it also is a mindset to discover and be curious about what are the new threats or vulnerabilities that we may not have understood before. Because you can't recover what you don't understand. And that's typically the new source of where the challenge is of trying to make a rapid decision when an event occurs.
We've been talking about what keeps manufacturers up at night. I want to shift the table here and looking ahead, what's the disruption scenario that keeps you up at night that the manufacturing sector is largely ignoring?
Well, I think the way I'd look at it is it's not just about AI, even though that gets all the headlines. And it's not just cyber or cloud like we've talked about with SaaS systems, though that's increasingly important. Um, it's the overall complexity of operational dependencies, the compounding nature of it. An average manufacturer now depends on hundreds of software applications, dozens of service providers, and really increasingly complex multi-tier supplier networks. And every digital transformation is creates new opportunities for new capabilities, but also creates these new dependencies. So resilience is becoming less about predicting specific disruptions and more about understanding how your business actually functions as a connected system. And the organizations that continuously map and understand those dependencies will respond faster no matter what the next disruption looks like. I mean, one of the things I've seen over 30 years in supply chain is that companies rarely struggle because they lack talented people. They struggle because critical information is fragmented. I mean, we've seen this over years, right? Procurement has their view of the world. Operations has another. IT has another. Finance has another. And we've made a lot of progress in terms of providing, an integrated view of, my global supply chain and my manufacturing plans and my scheduling. We've made innovations in those core systems, but we really need to keep going. And the resilience is about connecting those different perspectives and those new dependencies quickly enough to make good decisions under pressure. Because a disruption is rarely what hurts you, it's the dependency you didn't know you had that the disruption would trigger, that you have to spend the time, that's your unknown. You have to spend that time to discover what it is. And that impacts your total time to recovery, and your decision cycle time is really what the new measurement of resilience is.
Well said. Thank you, Richard, for joining us on the show. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Captain. These are critical, evolving issues that I think are, on one hand, um, a natural extension to great manufacturing operations leaders' systems thinking. We've done all this great work to look at our material capacity flows and constraints and cost, models, et cetera. We just got to keep going, and we got to think more holistically still about the full dependency map, and make sure that we've done that work as best we can so that when disruption occurs, we can optimize the decision making cycle time, recover faster, and protect as much customer revenue as possible.
Great advice. Thank you again.